Wind moved like a whisper through the empty cargo yard, and the night lamps flickered over metal crates and broken machines. And Jack walked with a careful step, his hand near his sidearm, his breath held tight because something felt wrong. Something watched him from the dark. He was off duty. Yet duty lived inside him, a habit that never slept, so he followed the faint scraping sound to an old crate with a dented lid. The paint was faded. The code stamp was half peeled. The crate smelled like rust and sand, and the sound came again. Soft but sharp, like claws on steel. Jack lifted the lid, and a shape tried to spring out, small and fast, but the jump failed. The shape slammed back into the crate wall and hissed. Then a pair of bright eyes locked on him, wide and fierce. Eyes that glowed a cool silver under the lamp. He saw a slim body wrapped in torn cloth, skin with a pale blue tone, hair like night water, braided in rough strips, and a thin line of dark blood at the side of her neck. She did not look weak. She looked cornered, like a wild thing forced into a corner and ready to bite. Jack spoke in a calm voice. "Hands open." He said he did not want to hurt her. He only wanted to know who she was and why she was hiding in his yard. The shape answered with a low voice that carried grit and pride. She said her name was Lyra, and he should close the lid and forget he saw her. He should have walked away. He knew that. The colony outpost had rules, and rules said report strange visitors. The rules also said help the lost if they were not a threat. But this one was a threat, or at least she looked like one. There was a heat in her eyes that said she would not obey, not beg, not trust. He saw the bleeding again. Darker now, the cloth wet near her shoulder. The wound looked deep, the kind that weakens the legs and blurs the mind. He asked who hurt her. She turned her face away and said it did not matter. She would heal. She did not need a human to touch her, and if he tried, she would break his fingers. Jack felt a rough anger rise, not pure anger, more like fear mixed with care. A storm in his chest. He had patched up miners and smugglers, and even a thief who stabbed him. He had never walked past someone bleeding and let them die. He looked at Lyra and said, "Fine, be stubborn. But if she stays in the cold, she will lose that fight with the dark." She slid out of the crate and stood with a wobble. Then her back straightened, chin high, jaw set. She had that look, the look of someone who learned to fight long before she learned to rest. She moved one step, her knees shook. She tried to hide it, but Jack saw the pain strike through her like lightning. He reached to steady her. She brushed his hand away and tried to walk. Her foot caught on a bolt. She stumbled hard. The world tilted. Jack caught her anyway. Her breath hitched. The pride in her eyes flashed into shame and then into anger again. She pushed at his chest, but the push had no strength left. "What am I supposed to do with you?" Jack shouted. The words ripped out before he could stop them. "What am I supposed to do with a fugitive who would rather bleed out than accept help?" She went still in his arms. The word fugitive hung in the air like smoke. She stared at him and asked how he knew. He pointed his chin at the dark strip of metal on her wrist, a broken restraint with alien etchings, and at the small locator chip she had crushed under her heel. The chip still blinked once in a while like a dying star. Lyra breathed in slow. Her voice became flat. She said she would be gone by dawn. He should not get involved. They would come for her, and they would bring noise and fire and grief. Humans always paid when they stood near her. Every world she crossed earned a scar. Jack thought about the outpost, the families, the kids who played with little drones near the fence, the old cook who kept extra bread for travelers, the mechanic who let him borrow tools. He thought about those people and about the way Lyra swayed on her feet while pretending not to sway. And he made a choice that felt both foolish and right. He told her to save her breath. He would not leave her out here. He would take her to his workshop behind the hangar. He had a med kit. He had clean water. He had a heater that groaned, but worked. If she wanted to run after that, fine. But she was not going to collapse in the dirt like a broken machine left for scrap. She tried to argue, her mouth hard, her words brave, but her knees folded. Her body told the truth, her pride would not. Jack lifted her as if she were a bundle of wires and cloth, lighter than she looked, heat pouring from her skin. He moved fast through the alleys of shadow and lamplight, past the silent loader bots and the piles of scrap that hid nests of dusty moths. In the workshop, the air held the smell of oil and old engines. The workbench was messy, tools in crooked rows. A half-built drone lay open like a puzzle waiting for the last piece. Jack set Lyra on the cot he kept for long nights. He checked the door lock twice. Then he pulled on thin gloves and opened the med kit with a snap that sounded loud in the small room. Lyra watched his hands, ready to flinch, ready to strike, but his hands moved steady, gentle, like a mechanic around a delicate coil. He asked permission before he touched the wound. She nodded once, her jaw tight. He cleaned the blood. He found a deep cut and signs of a burn near the edge, a messy mix that spoke of a fight and a blast. He worked in silence for a while. The only sounds were her breathing and the small clicks of vials and the soft rustle of fresh bandage. He used a coagulant patch that warmed under his fingers. He sealed the edges. He wrapped the shoulders snug and neat. He kept his eyes calm. Not pitying, not harsh, just present when he finished. He poured water into a cup and held it out. She stared, then took it. Her hands shook. A little water spilled on her knuckles and ran down. She drank and coughed and drank again, then leaned back with her eyes closed. He asked if she could eat. She said later, her voice almost a whisper. The workshop lights hummed. The heater clicked and rattled, and then settled. Jack pulled up a chair and sat. Not too close, not far. And he asked again who hurt her. Not because the answer would change what he had done, but because he needed to know what storm was riding. Toward his door, Lyra opened her eyes and looked at him like she weighed the shape of his soul. She said a syndicate owned many routes in the outer lanes. They moved cargo in fear. They used people, they used worlds, and they wanted her for something she would never give. Jack asked what that something was. She looked away and did not answer. He heard a faint thump outside. Just a wind gust knocking a loose panel. Or so he told himself. He stood and checked the camera feed on a small screen. Only the empty yard showed, crates and long shadows. No movement, no heat signature. Yet his neck prickled. The kind of chill that told a soldier to trust the quiet less than the noise. He turned back to her and said he did not trust her story yet, but he trusted what he saw. A person hurt and holding on with teeth and will. He could respect that. He also said the outpost had kids and elders, and if her trouble brought fire, he would move her out of here by dawn. He would not let this place burn. Lyra sat up more straight. The bandage tugged, and she winced, but did not let the pain bend her. She asked why he cared at all. He could hand her to the patrol and sleep easy. He gave a small half-smile that did not reach his eyes. He said easy sleep was a myth for people who never made choices that mattered. Silence grew between them. Not cold, not warm. A silence like two cliffs facing the same sea. Lyra looked at his tools, at the patch on his jacket, at the thin scar above his brow. She asked if he had fought before. He said yes, once for pay, later for people. Now mostly for the peace of small places like this. She nodded. Something in her set of shoulders softened. Not much, just a fraction. She said she would stay until dawn. Then she would be gone. He said fine, dawn it is. He gave her a blanket. She refused it. He set it on the cot anyway. Then he turned the heater a little higher and checked the lock. Again his hand hovered over the switch that would send a quiet alert to the patrol. He did not press it. He sat back down and watched the door, the camera feed, the slow rise and fall of Lyra's breath, and the thin silver glow of her eyes when she opened them for a second, as if to make sure he was still there outside. Wind shifted, and far off, a light winked on the ridge where the desert met the sky. It could have been a drone. It could have been a star. Jack felt the storm choose its path, and he knew that the words he had shouted in the yard were not only anger. They were a question he would have to answer with deeds before the sun touched the landing pads again. The night stretched long, and the silence inside the workshop felt like a heavy blanket, wrapping everything in stillness. Jack sat on the worn-out chair, eyes flicking from the door to the quiet form of Lyra on the cot. The heater hummed in the corner, its soft noise the only thing that broke the silence. Lyra lay still, her breath shallow, but the tension in her body never fully left. She had tried to hide the pain, but he saw through it. He'd seen too many people fight their own bodies in this kind of situation, refusing to admit how broken they were until it was too late. Lyra was no different. Her tough exterior was cracked, and behind her cold eyes, Jack saw something else, a quiet desperation, something she refused to speak about. Jack's fingers tapped nervously on his knee, his mind racing. The outpost was quiet, too quiet. Number. Patrols, no signs of trouble, just the kind of peace that always made Jack uneasy. He had a feeling that something was coming, something bigger than the quiet alien woman lying on his cot. Lyra stirred slightly, her eyes opening to find Jack staring at her. Her lips parted, like she wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. She glanced away, focusing on the wall across from her, her jaw tight. Jack knew better than to push, so he let the silence settle between them. Minutes passed, but Jack couldn't stop thinking about her, about the truth she hadn't told him. What was so important that the alien syndicate would send hunters after her? What was it that had made her run? There was more to Lyra than just a fugitive, and he knew it. But she wasn't ready to share. Not yet. "You're not from here, are you?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Lyra's eyes flicked to him quickly, her gaze hard but tired. "No," she replied curtly. "I'm not from here." "Then where?" Jack pressed, but this time, he wasn't expecting an easy answer. Lips tightened, and she didn't look at him as she answered. "Far from here. Too far for you to understand." The words were wrapped in a cold bitterness, and Jack couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. He was starting to feel like he was chasing shadows. But the answer was in her eyes, in the way she held herself, in the way she was willing to die rather than speak of it. He just had to get her to open up. He just had to keep her alive long enough for that to happen. Jack stood up, pacing to the small window at the back of the workshop. He could see the outpost from here, empty buildings. Dim lights, nothing unusual. But in the distance, a faint red glow caught his eye. Something was moving out there. Something big. A fleet of ships? A group of soldiers? He couldn't tell from this distance, but it made his stomach tighten. Lyra had noticed too. She turned. Her head, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows outside the window. "They're coming," she muttered, barely a whisper. Jack turned to face her, the anxiety in her voice making his pulse race. "Who's coming?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. She closed her eyes like she was weighing the decision to tell him. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. "The Syndicate's enforcers. They'll come for me. And if they don't find me, they'll burn this place to the ground." Jack felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. "You're not alone in this, Lyra," he said, moving back to her side. "You won't be." She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a resigned sadness. "You don't understand. You don't know who they are. They don't stop. Not until they get what they want." Jack didn't like the sound of that. He had a feeling that whatever she had, whatever information she was hiding, was the reason everything was going to hell. And as much as he hated it, Jack knew that he couldn't let her go. Not now. He glanced at the door, the shadows creeping. At the edges. "What happens if I turn you in? Will they leave us alone?" Lyra's eyes snapped to him, the challenge clear in her gaze. "You're not that kind of person, Jack. You don't turn people in. Not when they're struggling to survive." Jack couldn't argue with that. He wasn't that kind of person. But he was starting to wonder if helping her might cost him everything. His outpost, his friends, his life. "I don't know how much time we have," Jack said, his voice strained. "But if we're going to do this, we need to be ready. They'll be on us before sunrise, and when they come, His voice trailed off, the weight of the situation settling in. He couldn't think of everything. He had to focus on the now. Protecting her, keeping them both alive long enough to figure out what came next. Lyra nodded, her body stiff. I can fight, but I need a weapon. You're not getting a gun, Jack said quickly, his tone firm. You don't even know how to use one. We'll fight on our terms. She glared at him, but Jack didn't back down. You can help me get the place ready. We'll set up traps. I'll cover the rest. Lyra didn't like it, but she didn't argue either. She nodded, slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Fine, but if you get me killed, I'll haunt you. Jack smiled grimly, the tension never leaving his shoulders. Deal. They worked in silence for a while, gathering what they could. Jack didn't speak much, didn't need to. The only sound in the workshop was the soft clink of tools, hum of the heater, and the occasional rustling of Lyra as she moved through the cluttered room. She was strong, her mind already working on escape plans, on how to survive. But Jack could tell there was something in her that still fought against the idea of depending on someone. Even when it was clear she needed help, the red glow in the distance grew brighter, and Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The outpost was about to be under siege, and he knew that once the Syndicate found out what was here, it would never be the same. We need to move now, Jack said, looking out the window. He turned to Lyra, who had finally stopped moving, staring out into the same dark horizon. It's time. Lyra gave a stiff nod, her eyes hard with determination. The fight was coming, and she wasn't going to run anymore. The quiet had become unbearable, the kind of silence that only came before a storm, before the chaos would break into the peacefulness of the night. Jack stood near the window, his eyes trained on the distant horizon where that red glow continued to burn brighter. He could feel the tension building inside him. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. Lyra stood beside him, her body rigid, her eyes scanning the shadows, the same flicker of worry in her expression that Jack knew all too well. He could see it in her stance, in the way. Her fingers twitched every now and then as though she were ready to spring into action. She wasn't the type to wait around, but she knew, just like Jack knew, that this time there was no running. There was no escape. Jack broke the silence, his voice low but firm. We need to set the traps. If they're coming for us, they'll be expecting a fight. Lyra didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She grabbed a few items from the cluttered workbench, her movements quick and decisive. It was clear that, despite the fear hanging in the air, she was ready. She had been ready for this all along, but now she had to face it head-on with someone else at her side. The difference now was that someone cared. Jack didn't waste any time. He grabbed tools from the shelves, setting to work with the precision of someone who had done this before. He set out a series of wires, connecting them to a series of makeshift triggers that could cause a distraction or make the enemy trip or fall, whatever worked. Every movement was done without thought, a well-rehearsed routine of someone who had spent years preparing for the worst. Lyra helped, but she didn't seem to care about the small details. She moved swiftly, working alongside Jack to reinforce their defenses. But every now and then, Jack caught her looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting back to the window. He didn't blame her. They both knew what was coming. They could feel it in their bones, in the way the air smelled. It was like the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the moment it would all come crashing down. They finished setting up the last of the traps, just as the first faint sounds reached them. A distant rumble. Not thunder, but the sound of boots hitting the ground, of engines rumbling in the dark. The first wave was approaching. Lyra turned sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of a knife she had tucked into her waistband. Jack caught her arm, stopping her. His voice was a whisper, low and urgent. Not yet. Let them come closer. She didn't argue, though her eyes flashed with a challenge. They waited, both of them poised for the next move, their senses on high. Alert. The sound of movement grew louder, and Jack could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. It was only a matter of time before the enemy would break through, and they would have to fight or die. Finally, the first figure appeared at the edge of the yard, moving silently in the shadows, their form barely visible against the dark backdrop of the night. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just one figure. There were at least 5 of them, all wearing dark, armored suits that blended with the darkness around them. They moved like ghosts, their eyes hidden beneath the visors of their helmets. "Get ready," Jack murmured to Lyra. She nodded, her hand tightening around the knife handle, her grip steady. She was ready for this. But Jack didn't feel the same calm. He had to make the first move. He had to control the situation. If they waited too long, they would be surrounded, and there would be no way out. Jack crouched low, moving toward the far corner of the room. He had placed a small explosive device there earlier, one that was rigged to detonate with a simple trigger. It was designed to create chaos, to throw off their attackers just long enough for them to get an upper hand. Lyra followed him, her movements swift and quiet. They positioned themselves in their designated spots, and then they waited. The first few moments passed like an eternity, their breathing slow, their muscles tense, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Then the attack came. The first explosion went off, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath them. The blast sent dust and debris flying through the air, and Jack could hear the mercenaries' startled shouts. For a split second, there was confusion, panic. Jack knew it was their chance. He sprang into action, his body moving like clockwork, his instincts taking over. Lyra was at his side, her knife flashing as she sliced through the first mercenary's suit with a deadly precision. Jack tackled the next one, knocking him to the ground with the force of his body. They were fast, they were trained, but Jack and Lyra had something they didn't: determination. The second wave of mercenaries came charging through the smoke and dust, their weapons raised and firing. Jack barely had time to react. He ducked behind the workbench, narrowly avoiding a shot that would have left him dead. Lyra was faster, though, her movements swift as she grabbed a piece of metal from the floor and hurled it at one of the mercenaries, knocking him off balance. "Focus!" Jack shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. He moved quickly, his gun drawn, firing at the next mercenary who had advanced too close. The shot rang out, and the enemy fell, but there were more coming. He could hear them, see them through the smoke, their dark figures closing in. Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed another piece of metal and hurled it at another mercenary, knocking him out cold. She was becoming more ruthless with every move, her confidence growing as the fight continued. But Jack knew this wasn't over yet. The explosions had created an opening, but they wouldn't last long. Soon, the full force of the mercenaries would be upon them. Jack glanced at Lyra, and their eyes met for just a second, the understanding clear between them. They were in this together, and they had to win. There was no other option. Jack made his move, darting forward with Lyra close behind. They worked like a single unit, covering each other's backs, anticipating each other's moves. Jack shot another mercenary in the shoulder, and Lyra followed with a swift strike to the neck, taking down another one. They were slowly pushing them back, but it wasn't enough. More mercenaries were coming, and they were running out of time. "Keep moving," Jack yelled, his voice strained with urgency. "We need to make it to the other side. We'll make our stand there." Lyra didn't argue. She moved with him, both of them sprinting through the yard, dodging gunfire, running for their lives. Jack could hear the mercenaries getting closer, but he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when they had fought this hard to survive. They were both alive, and they were going to stay that way. They reached the other side of the yard, where Jack had set up more traps. They turned, ready to face whatever was coming next. The mercenaries were close now, their footsteps echoing in the silence. And Jack knew the final fight was about to begin. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, the distant crackle of fire creeping into the workshop like an unwanted guest. Jack's heart beat faster, his palms slick with sweat as he peered around the corner of the makeshift barricade. The mercenaries were closing in, their footsteps heavy, their weapons drawn. They were relentless, but so was he. He had no choice but to fight, to stand his ground. There was no going back now. Lyra stood beside him, her body tense, her grip on the knife tighter than ever. She was breathing heavily, but her eyes, those eyes that had been filled with defiance and anger, now held something else. A quiet understanding. She knew what they had to do. She had fought on her own for so long, but now she had someone by her side. They were in this together, and neither of them was going down without a fight. We can't hold them off forever. Jack muttered, his voice low but filled with determination. His eyes darted to the shadows beyond the barricade, watching for any movement. Lyra nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I know," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a strange mix of calm and urgency. "But we can make it hurt. We can make them regret coming here." Jack smirked despite the weight of the situation. He couldn't help but admire her spirit. She had every reason to run, to give up, but instead, she chose to fight. She chose to stand beside him, even though he knew she had every right to keep her distance. That kind of loyalty wasn't something Jack took lightly. The sound of boots crunching against the gravel reached Jack's ears, and his grip tightened on his weapon. They were almost there. He could hear their muffled voices, the calls to each other as they searched for them. They knew they were here, but they didn't know where. Jack and Lyra were hidden, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "We don't have much time," Jack said, glancing over at Lyra. "When I make my move, you follow. We take out as many as we can before they get close." Lyra's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, Jack saw something softer in her gaze. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. Whatever it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared. She nodded and raised her weapon, ready to fight. Then, with a sudden burst of action, Jack darted from the cover of the barricade, his weapon raised as he fired. The first mercenary went down with a sharp cry, falling to the ground in a heap. His comrades reacted immediately, scrambling for cover, shouting orders into their coms. Lyra was right behind him, her movements swift and deadly. She closed the gap between her and the nearest mercenary in seconds, her knife flashing in the dim light as she took him down with a single strike. The mercenary never saw it coming. He collapsed without a sound. The chaos erupted all around them. The mercenaries returned fire, their weapons blazing in the darkness. But Jack and Lyra were faster. They were a well-coordinated team, moving like shadows, unpredictable and deadly. Jack fired another shot, hitting a mercenary square in the chest. He didn't have time to enjoy the victory. More were coming. More were always coming. Lyra ducked behind a crate, her breathing steady despite the chaos. Jack joined her, his back pressed against the cold metal as he reloaded. He could hear the mercenaries closing in, their footsteps quickening, their voices sharp. They were getting closer, and Jack knew they didn't have much time before the entire yard was swarming with enemies. "We need to move," Jack said urgently, glancing around the corner of the crate. "If we stay here, they'll trap us." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "Where to?" "Follow me," Jack replied, and he moved quickly, gesturing for her to follow. "We head for the warehouse. It's bigger, and it has more cover. We can make a stand there." They ran, their footsteps light on the gravel, their breath coming in sharp bursts as they darted from cover to cover. The mercenaries were still chasing them, but Jack could hear the confusion in their voices. They were losing control, and Jack was determined to keep them off balance. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark outline barely visible against the night sky. Jack reached the door first, his hand on the handle, but he paused. Something didn't feel right. He glanced over his shoulder, his instincts telling him they were being followed too closely. "There's too many of them," Jack muttered, eyes narrowing as he scanned the yard. "We need to make them think we're going one way, then we hit them from the other." Lyra's face was set in a hard line, her jaw clenched as she nodded. "Lead the way." With a sudden burst of movement, Jack ran toward the far end of the warehouse, Lyra following close behind. They moved silently, like ghosts in the night, their feet light against the ground. The mercenaries, thinking they were going to the main entrance, had followed their false trail. Jack stopped near the back of the building, the metal door slightly ajar. He pushed it open with one hand, and Lyra slipped through beside him. They were now inside, hidden from the mercenaries, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. They didn't waste any time. Jack gestured to the side, where a stack of crates loomed. They crouched behind them, their weapons ready, their bodies tense, waiting for the inevitable. Moments passed, but it felt like hours. The sounds of the mercenaries searching the yard drifted toward them, and Jack's eyes narrowed as he heard their voices getting closer. They were within striking distance. All they had to do now was wait for the perfect moment, and then it came. The sound of boots against the metal floor rang out, sharp and clear. The first mercenary appeared at the corner, moving cautiously, his weapon raised. Jack didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he stepped out from behind the crates and fired, the shot landing dead center in the mercenary's chest. The man dropped without a sound, his body crumpling to the floor. Lyra was right behind him, her knife slashing through the air as she took down another mercenary. The fight was fierce, fast, and brutal. But Jack and Lyra were faster. Together, they made a lethal team. Their enemies never saw them coming. As the last of the mercenaries fell, Jack took a moment to catch his breath, his body still tense, his mind racing. They had done it. They had won. But the danger wasn't over. Not yet. Jack looked over at Lyra, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes were calm, focused. She had fought like a warrior, like someone who had been doing this her whole life. And maybe she had. "We're not done," Jack said, his voice steady. "We need to get to the ship. It's the only way out." Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. "Let's go." They moved quickly, their bodies working together as they ran toward the hangar where the ship awaited. But even as they ran, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. The worst was still to come. And he had no idea just how much more Lyra had to reveal. The hangar loomed ahead, the large metal doors barely open, just wide enough to squeeze through. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty space as he and Lyra ran toward the ship. The weight of what they had just done pressed on his shoulders, but there was no time to reflect. There was no time for anything but getting to the ship and escaping before the rest of the mercenaries arrived. Lyra's breath was steady beside him, but Jack could tell she was struggling. They had both been through too much, fought too hard. She kept her eyes forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife, ready for whatever might come next. They reached the ship's entrance, and Jack quickly tapped the access panel. The doors hissed open, revealing the cramped interior of the ship. It wasn't much, just a small, barely operational transport, but it was their ticket out. They didn't need much, just enough to get them away from the mercenaries and the hell they had left behind. Jack climbed inside first, scanning the ship's controls. Lyra followed closely behind, her movements sharp and precise, like she had been trained for moments like this. They had to move fast. Jack slammed his hand on the button to close the doors. The familiar hum of the engines came to life, the low growl of power running through the ship. It wasn't the smoothest start, but it would do. He knew the basics of this ship, just enough to get it off the ground and out of range of the mercenaries. That was all they needed. Lyra took a seat beside him, her eyes scanning the viewscreen as the stars outside began to blur. Her face was hard, focused, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't letting herself relax, not yet. Neither was he. He flipped a few switches, sending the ship into the air. It shook slightly, but the controls responded, and they were off. The hangar quickly grew smaller in the distance as they soared higher into the sky. But Jack knew they couldn't stop here. Not until they were clear. Not until they were out of danger. Doc tapped a few more buttons, checking the radar. He could see the faint blips of incoming ships, mercenary vessels closing in on their position. They were faster than him, more powerful, and Jack didn't have the luxury of being careful anymore. It was a race to survive. We're not clear yet, Jack said, his voice steady but tight with urgency. He pushed the ship's throttle forward, the engines roaring louder as they surged forward. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she looked at the radar. How long until they catch up? Not long, Jack replied. They're faster. But we're going to need to make some moves if we're going to shake them off. Lyra turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with that same fire in her eyes, the fire that had gotten them this far. We can't outrun them, Lyra said finally, her voice calm but filled with determination. But we can outsmart them. Jack glanced over at her, raising an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? We need to make them think we're heading in one direction, then we change course, confuse them, throw them off our trail. Jack nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. He'd done it before. It was a classic trick: fake them out and use the terrain to your advantage. The problem was, they were heading straight toward an asteroid field, and the mercenaries would know it. They wouldn't fall for that trick. But Jack didn't have much of a choice. You ready? Jack asked, his fingers flying over the controls as he adjusted the ship's course. Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the weapons panel, her fingers hovering over the buttons. She wasn't afraid of what was coming. She was ready to fight. Jack could feel that same readiness in the air. They both knew that this wouldn't be easy, but it was their best shot. He adjusted the ship's trajectory, sending them into a wide arc that would take them toward the asteroid field. The radar was still buzzing with the mercenaries' movements, but they were going to fall for it, he hoped. He just needed a little more time. The asteroid field was ahead, its vast expanse, stretching out like a giant maze of rock and debris. It was the perfect place to hide, to lose the pursuers in the chaos, but it was also the most dangerous place they could go. One wrong move and they'd be dead. Jack didn't slow down. He punched the throttle, sending the ship hurtling toward the asteroid field. The mercenaries were close behind, their ships closing the gap with deadly precision. But Jack knew the terrain. He knew the field. It was their only chance. Hold on. Jack shouted over his shoulder as the ship jolted, diving into the asteroid field with a violent twist. The ship shook violently, and Lyra gripped the side of her seat, her eyes focused on the screen, watching the asteroids fly past at terrifying speed. The mercenaries were right behind them, but Jack was faster. He twisted the ship, weaving through the rocks, dodging one massive asteroid after another. The mercenaries weren't as skilled at flying through the maze of space debris. Jack had the edge, but just as he thought they were going to make it, a massive explosion rocked the ship. Jack's heart skipped a beat as the ship jolted sideways, sparks flying from the control panel. He quickly steadied the ship, his hands moving frantically to regain control. Are you all right? Jack asked, his voice tight with concern. Lyra nodded, her face pale but determined. I'm fine, keep flying. Jack gritted his teeth. The mercenaries had landed a hit. The ship's hull had taken some damage, but it wasn't enough to bring them down, not yet. He pushed the ship harder, using every bit of skill he had to dodge the oncoming rocks, the mercenary ships, and the constant barrage of fire. Another explosion rocked the ship, this time from behind. They were close now, too close. Jack glanced at the radar. One more hit, and they were done for. But then something changed. In the chaos, Jack saw a faint signal on the radar. A blip that wasn't coming from the mercenary ships. It was another ship, an unfamiliar signature. And it was heading straight for them. What the hell? Jack muttered under his breath. Lyra, look at this. Lyra turned to the radar. What is that? Jack didn't answer. He knew what it was. It was their salvation. He pushed the ship into a sharp turn, using the asteroid field for cover. The unfamiliar ship was coming closer, fast. The mercenaries were closing in on them. But they didn't expect what was about to happen. The new ship dropped out of warp just behind the mercenaries, firing a precise burst of weapons that knocked one of the mercenary ships out of the sky. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was help. Help had arrived. As the mercenaries scrambled to adjust, Jack's ship moved swiftly through the debris, taking the chance he had been waiting for. He powered the engines forward, his hands steady on the controls. Get us out of here, Jack, Lyra said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. Jack didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle forward, racing away from the mercenaries and toward the new ship. They were free. For now. And as the mercenary ships fell behind, Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. We're not done yet, he said, his voice quieter now. But we're alive. Lyra looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. For now. And with that, they both knew one thing. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.